Hello, I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and your podcast host.
Hi, I'm Yara. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center.
Hi, I'm Rami Khouri. I'm a distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut and a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington.
Hi, I'm Hanna Alshaikh. I'm the Palestine Project Coordinator at Arab Center, Washington, and a PhD candidate in History and Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another Hiwar episode of this podcast. Hiwar is the Arabic word for dialogue or discussion, and in each one of these episodes, I, along with my Arab Center colleagues, discuss some of the big issues of the day. A lot has happened since we last spoke when we covered the open war between Israel and Iran, and then, of course, U.S. strikes on Iran. Since then, the situation in Gaza has only continued to deteriorate as Israel's military both expanded its military presence in the Strip on the ground and also tightened its siege, leading to unprecedented levels of starvation. This is where we'll start our discussion today. Yara, I want to begin with you. We have seen images coming out of Gaza. The whole world has started to see images coming out of Gaza of the bodies of emaciated children, and not just children, adults as well. And you know, we have seen horrific images coming out of Gaza for a very, very long time now. But it seems like this latest bit of information coming out of Gaza specifically about the starvation and the hunger, and we should be clear, it's deliberate starvation of the people in the Gaza Strip. It seems to have hit a nerve internationally almost in a different way than what we've seen before. And there's been a lot more conversation about the policy of starvation, its impacts on the people there. And there's also been a lot more focus on this thing called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We started to hear from whistleblowers involved in this. And we've talked about this in previous Hiwar episodes, but I think it'll be good for us to kind of go back a little bit, especially in this moment, remind people about what this thing is, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, sort of where it came from, what it replaced, and what it's meant for people on the ground before we talk a little bit more about, just where we go from here in terms of the impact of starvation. So if you can kind of take it away with that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Yousef. I wasn't sure the GHF would still even be operating at this point. So I think it's really important for us to kind of drill back to the beginning. So in terms of its actual implementation, the GHF did not start operating until late spring 2025. And it's came in a period after a significantly tightened or essentially complete siege of Gaza that was imposed by Israel in early March. This is, of course, following the siege period before that. And from March to April, if you look at the UN data on truckloads, not a single aid truck entered the Gaza Strip. Of course, the inevitable happened, what's been inevitable for more than a year or so, which was that the warnings of famine, the talk of Gaza being on the precipice of famine, eventually became what we all knew and thought it would become, which was famine. So there became significant international outrage about this in around April, May. And so Israel's solution, because their contention is that the previous UN distribution system, which had more than 400 sites throughout the Gaza Strip, and let's be clear, still was insufficient in terms of feeding people adequate amounts. There was still hunger, malnutrition, and starvation that happened in the preceding 16 months or something. But Israel's contention was that these aid sites were no longer acceptable because their claims that Hamas looted the aid, stole the aid, even though, and since since even in the past week or so, there's been multiple investigative reports by international news outlets that not only is there no evidence that Hamas does this, but that Israeli intelligence and IDF officials know this and have said, we don't actually have evidence that Hamas does this. Anyway, so what Israel has done, essentially closed every border crossing, regardless of the UN associated trucks, thousands of them that are waiting on the border. And they have completely consolidated the aid system into what they called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. If it sounds creepy and opaque, that's because it is. It is essentially an Israeli and US-backed effort that came as now we've learned, as a result of discussions that were happening at the end of 2023 by American and Israeli military and business folks about what they planned to do with what was inevitable even to them at the time, which was a starvation crisis that they thought even the best public diplomacy or public relations could not manage. So lo and behold, with a very complex web of consultation groups and private contractors in the US, including military contractors, and with full Israeli support, the GHF started in the late spring. So it replaced the 400 UN aid sites with 4 sites. I believe we talked a little bit about that. And the sites have become death zones. Almost every day, there are dozens of reports of Palestinians that have been killed at the sites. And now there is, almost endless reporting from not just American contractors at the sites, but Israeli soldiers themselves, that they were essentially told to shoot at anyone who ran any given direction, at crowds, at people who even came to the sites even a minute or 5 before it opened, at people who simply looked suspicious. I mean, this is nothing new. We've seen intentional targeting of civilian targets this entire time. And now we know that was part of the process. So the aid that has gotten in, so people are getting some food at these sites, and the GHF absolutely loves to brag about how many meals it's giving. But even by its own standard, it's the amount of meals that it's given is an absolute drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. We have not just people who are hungry at this point. 6, 10, 12 months ago, we could use words like hungry. People are no longer hungry. They're no longer to a point where food is even needed. For some of them, there's more than 30,000 cases of severe acute malnutrition in children. They need more than just some canned vegetables or whatever they've been given in these aid parcels. They need therapeutic foods to replace calories, vitamins, minerals, etc. The GHF sites are not giving this. We heard, as you said, global outcry about this when the images and videos were too much to bear. This was met with the completely and utterly predictable discrediting of these photos and pictures. Of course, the Palestinians are making it up as though they have time and these television production studios all throughout Gaza to do this kind of thing. And the fact that there's been basically endless videos showing the starvation, showing shootings at the sites. We've seen Netanyahu seemed to agree to allow a more minimal amount of aid. We saw the aid drops that have killed Palestinians in the past and give very little aid restart with the support of some of the Arab states, including Jordan. But we've seen really no meaningful movement on this. And perhaps later in the discussion, we can touch on what that actually looks like.
Thank you for that, Yara. I think one of the key things that you mentioned here is that the way this was set up, there was a process in which this took place, right? First, we saw really the vilification of every other aid delivery mechanism, that from UNRWA, that from other international aid agencies, which were, still not getting the necessary amount of aid in, but getting a heck of a lot more aid in than what we're seeing now. And after these efforts were demonized and attacked and effectively prevented from operating in Gaza, what they were ultimately replaced with was this scheme that was set up in a way, as you noted, 4 distribution sites in place of 400. It was never set up with the intention of actually delivering humanitarian aid. And I don't think any objective observer who looks at the way it was set up could come away with the conclusion that it was. Instead, what we have, right, is an effort to kind of paint a picture that there is some kind of humanitarian delivery going on to try to allay or hold back some of the anger about the humanitarian situation globally as Israel continues on with its other objectives in Gaza, which ultimately are about pushing Palestinians out of there. And we're hearing more and more talk about that openly from Israeli officials, leaders in the government, and opinion polls in Israel point to a huge number of Israelis that would be happy to see Palestinians pushed out of the Gaza Strip entirely.
And can I
Go ahead.
just quickly add? I mean, this is all about, as you noted, offering plausible deniability to Israel and its allies of what its policies are creating. This is the peer all over again. This is the aid drops all over again. In this case, actually, literally. This is about, for some reason, the image of the bombings and the amputated children and the people carrying their family members in plastic bags is somehow not as impactful as images of starvation. So while we got condemnations of those attacks, those were in the minds, I think, of many justifiable. I can't get into that. I don't know how, but starvation seems to be something different. And when you noted the displacement and ethnic cleansing, I don't know if we previously discussed that all 4 of these sites are in the south, to where Israel is trying to not motivate, not incentivize, but force Palestinians to move to. They've said since basically November, when there was the first push of getting people from the north to south, we started seeing maps floated around of these buffer zones, security zones. We started hearing of conferences held in Israel called Preparing to Settle Gaza. So the fact that all these sites are in the south, so for the few that do remain in the north, and I know people who are still there, basically the choice has been come to these sites and potentially get killed, or starve. And some, this is not, you don't have to believe us. Listen to the words, as you just said, of Israeli officials themselves. They want to get the Palestinians out. They want to create conditions that are so difficult it's impossible to stay. They want to call it voluntary immigration, and then they want to settle on that land. That's what they've said.
Right. And now we're starting to hear about the expansion, even further expansion of Israeli military operations in Gaza. I want to talk about that in a minute, but first, I want to put it in the broader regional context of Israel's militarism well beyond Gaza. In Lebanon, obviously, last time we chatted, we talked about unprecedented Israeli strikes in Iran. And since then, we've seen continued Israeli military strikes in Syria. We saw an episode in Sueda where Israel was involved. There was a tremendous amount of violence. And I think it speaks to, this new era we're in of really Israel being able to do as it pleases, where it pleases, in a much wider geographic space than ever before, attempting to shape outcomes as it pleases. And I wanted to ask Rami to talk us through what we saw in Sueda, what Israel's role is and intentions are in Syria, and where things might go from here in that space.
Yeah, thank you, Yousef. And I'll continue from what Yara said, because there is a direct continuity between what's going on in Palestine now and what happened in the past and what's going on in Syria, and I would add Lebanon in the last few days. And the common denominator is that the whole Zionist process from 1915 until today has been to achieve what the Israel state with Western support is doing in much of Gaza and the West Bank, which is to kill or drive out or force out the Palestinians so that they can have their dominant Jewish Israeli Zionist state in all of Palestine. And this has been one version of a wider tradition in the region in which the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel have worked closely with Western powers, mainly the US and the UK and the French, with some others making guest appearances, to essentially keep the Arab region divided, fragmented, weak, constantly at war, and scurrying around for survival so that they couldn't develop the kind of strength or solid developmental base or political resistance to challenge what the Israelis have been doing in terms of taking over all of Palestine. So in Syria, we saw very dramatically in the last 2-3 weeks the tensions that arise when Arab countries that were created in around 1920 or so after World War I, so Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, all these countries and others, when they've never given their own people an opportunity to be really self-determinant, to shape their own governance system, to define their national values, to define the role of the state and the rights of citizens. That's never happened in any Arab country. And the result is you get tensions between subgroups, and even within the subgroups, so the Druze, the Alawites, the Kurds, the Christians, the various Sunni, Shia Muslims, whatever the subgroup may be, you get tensions among them with the centralized state. And this is what we saw in Sweden, and always these things start with a local little incident, somebody offends somebody or detains somebody or injures somebody or whatever, or contract dispute, and people start confronting each other. And Sweden, it was Druze with some of the Arab tribes there, the Bedouin tribes. And then the central government tries to step in to calm things down, but ends up helping one group fight the other group, and then you get fighting with the central government, the Druze, the tribes, and then the Israelis jump in. And the big story here is that Israel always tries to take advantage of any opportunity in any Arab country to fragment the society, weaken the central government, exploit desperate conditions among some groups who then turn to Israel for assistance. Christians in Lebanon, some of them did this in the civil war. The Druze have done it to some extent in Syria, and other people around the region occasionally do this. And this is part of the whole colonial context. And it's really quite amazing that it still goes on. So you had in Sweden this fighting that the central government tried to stop. And then the Israelis started attacking the central government to send a message, keep your troops out of the south. Amazing that they would tell a sovereign state like Syria, you can't send government forces south near the border with Israel. They were also sending a message to the central government to keep the Turks out, don't let the Turks get too strong, and don't let the Iranians come back in. Whatever Israel wants to do, it does by using its military force mostly to do this. And the problem with Syria is that the incidents we saw in Sweden happened similarly with the Alawites in the northwest coast on the coast about 2, 3, 4 months ago, and are still going on with the Kurds in the north. American government-supported Kurdish groups that are negotiating with the central government. And the central issue is always, always trying to define a relationship that lets a coherent country take shape. But it's never done sincerely or fully, so that you don't really have full equal representation of the minority groups. The central power used to be the Alawites, now it's the former Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, sort of Salafi jihadis who've suddenly become more constitutionally minded leaders. The central power always has more power than anybody else. And not only the Kurds and the Alawites and the Druze are involved. You also are hearing noises from Christians after a bomb exploded in a church in Damascus 3 weeks ago, who are really worried about, are they safe? Will the central government protect them? And you also have tribes. There are big tribal groups all over the northeast and south of Syria who have links to other tribes in the region. They're worried too. And the central problem is they don't trust the central government. They don't have trust. So they can't really work out a coherent national mechanism to define the country, let it develop, etc. And the Israelis will keep pestering them with military attacks or try to entice them by saying we'll give you some medical aid to keep these situations fragmented. Lebanon has similarly now experienced another round of tension between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government because the Americans, to help the Israelis, the Americans are pressuring the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah. And Hezbollah says, we will happily disarm once there's a Lebanese government that protects all Lebanese, which there isn't and will never be because the Americans and the European colonial powers, to help the Israelis, will not allow a strong Lebanese military to develop. And so all of these things are tied together. And I think the point that I would emphasize is not only the logistics and the mechanics of fragmentation within individual countries and manipulation, it's the bigger problem, which we also see now manifested, ironically, while some Western countries saying they're going to acknowledge a Palestinian state. The bigger question is that it's obvious that when you look at the Americans in Lebanon and Syria and other places and some Western governments, they don't care about Arab rights. They only care about the supremacy or dominance of Israel in the region. And the Arabs are at their peril. They can die, they can suffer, they can leave. And so this is the problem. And it started with the Palestinians, 100 years ago, when the Western powers said, all right, let's create a Jewish state here, and the Palestinians make believe they don't exist. So I think we have to take this bigger picture while understanding that the individual countries basically need self-determinant, democratically shaped governments that respect their own people, which has never happened.
Yeah, and it seems like that that circle of impunity where Israeli action takes place, maybe it started in Palestine, but it seems to be ever expanding and growing. Now it's reached Iran. They're increasingly involved in Syria and Lebanon. And if you're sitting elsewhere in the region, maybe in Istanbul or maybe in the Gulf, you start wondering how long it's going to be before that circle expands into where you live. And it's probably shaping a lot of considerations in capitals throughout the region who are wondering how you have stability, prosperity, economic growth with, a hegemon like Israel, who seems to have lost all sense of control and proportion. And speaking of that, and getting back to Gaza, we are hearing now reports from Israel that the Israeli government wants to expand its military operations in Gaza to, quote, fully occupy the Gaza Strip. We'll unpack this a little bit. But before we do, I just want to remind folks sort of how we got to this place that we're at right now. In January, on Inauguration Day, with Donald Trump coming in, we saw the beginning of a long-awaited ceasefire prisoner exchange deal go into place. Palestinians and Israelis were exchanged, and there was a process in place for a first phase that lasted several weeks that was supposed to be followed by a second phase and ultimately a third, which would lead to the end of Israel's war on the people of Gaza. Predictably, it ended after phase one because the Israelis decided they simply did not want to participate in the deal anymore. And they resumed their bombardment of the Gaza Strip. And in the process, sealed the door completely cut off all humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip, which, of course, as we mentioned, was already insufficient. And the expansion of Israel's military operations at that time was, messaged as a way to continue squeezing Hamas to get a better deal at the negotiating table, because when the deal collapsed after phase one, they didn't like what they were hearing, and they figured with this increased pressure, they'd be able to get a better outcome. Well, we're at a point now where we've seen precisely what the results of that are. Several months later, Israel has not succeeded in releasing any more hostages. They have succeeded in making sure there is widespread starvation in Gaza. And I think they're at a point internationally, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, where there's more opposition to what they're doing than ever before. They control something like 75 or 80% of the Gaza Strip now, and the vast majority of the population is concentrated in the remaining territory. But now they're talking about going into those spaces as well. Hanna, what does this all mean? And where could things go from here if the Israelis do, in fact, take that step?
To understand where it's headed, I think sort of difficult to say with certainty. But to get there, I do think it's important that we look at how this situation was created. And I think what's really at stake right now, or I think what's really a motivating factor, and what really I think is something that's changing in a significant way, not enough to tip the scales, but enough to become a major factor, is that there are rapidly changing conditions in terms of Israeli internal affairs, which are deeply intertwined with this military decision and are getting more and more complicated really by the day. So we have to keep this in mind when we're thinking about Netanyahu's call for a reoccupation of the Gaza Strip, because it's really deepening rifts within Israel's security establishment in new ways. So at the moment, if we talk about what this means, Israeli troops are positioned in buffer zones and in security corridors within the Gaza Strip, and generally speaking, they attack Palestinians from outside of major population centers. And so to reoccupy Gaza, you would position your troops, presumably far more than what you have available, by the way, within cities and within densely populated makeshift, usually refugee camps. So of course, this would be deadly for Palestinians, and it will inevitably actually also stir up deep resentments within Israel for a host of reasons. And these things I think are important to think about. And I'll only name a few. There actually are a lot more than this. Maybe others might have some that I left out. One that you might think about is Israel's population size, where prolonged warfare is really difficult to sustain. And it's something that even David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the State of Israel, had cautioned his military against. We do not fight long wars. And so it's placed actually also a strain on the Israeli economy, because on the one hand, you have retaliatory attacks and sometimes, something like the brief war with Iran, where they were able to, in a lot of ways, match some of the level of attacks that Israel was inflicting upon them. But you also have the attacks from Yemen and the attacks from Iraq on ports and on, important centers for the Israeli economy. But you also have reservists that are leaving the workforce because they have to serve in the army. And also, reservists are increasingly unwilling to show up for duty. So there's some numbers out there. They say about 40 to 50% sometimes don't answer the call anymore to show up. We have a few, the case of, I think it was 3 members of the Nahad Brigade who actually refused to return due to mental health conditions. And it became a large controversy in Israel. They, at the last moment, were spared the prison time that they were sentenced to. Another major issue is that there's a rapidly increasing suicide rate amongst Israeli soldiers. About 50 that we know of so far. And then there are, sort of resurfacing tensions that come up periodically, but are, I think, about to reach a fever pitch right now within Israel about the conscription or exemption, I should say, of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community within Israel. There are tensions because there's a proposed bill to lift this exemption because of this need in Gaza. And this is really causing problems within Netanyahu's base. And then another major factor, and the last one I'll list for now, is that we just saw the deadliest period in the course of the entire war. During this operation, Gideon's Chariots, that built up to Netanyahu's demand to occupy Gaza. About 48 soldiers that we know of were killed during this operation. It might be a little bit more than this. And so I mentioned, like I said earlier, the tensions are not limited just to segments of this really ever polarized Israeli public. While there's a lot of support for the war in Israel, there are certain debates that I think are going to be escalating in the coming months, and new divides and new fault lines within Israeli politics seem to be coming up. But also, and I think most significantly right now, are that there are significant rifts within the Israeli security establishment itself. And how did this come about? Like we said, Israel's wrapping up this Operation Gideon's Chariots that it called, which began in May. It entailed a significant, intense military campaign. There were air, land, and sea operations aimed at what they called bringing the Gaza Strip under their control. What it means to bring the Gaza Strip under their control has become a major debate within the security establishment itself. And like we said, this operation has been extremely deadly for Palestinians, which, a population that now is also, I think we've exceeded 180 deaths due to starvation. We're also looking at Israel claiming to have control over about 75% of the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, there's a lot of criticism within Israel that this did not achieve its full goals, the stated goals of the operation, because it didn't free hostages and it did not eliminate Hamas. And so what we see now is that this operation and also the war itself are being discussed as failures in the Israeli media, but not only in places like Haaretz, where we were seeing this for some time, but also in other sources like Yedi'ot Ahronot, sometimes called Ynet, and the center-right publication Times of Israel. And in the Israeli public itself, we are seeing somewhat of a shift in certain places. And again, I will repeat the caution that the society is very polarized, and that it still is popular in some places. But nonetheless, we also have 2 open letters that circulated recently with a total of 2,400 signatures of Israeli artists and then architects and visual artists and designers on the other, calling for a ceasefire. Then we also have B'Tselem, which is a prominent Israeli human rights organization that finally has publicly called Israel's war in Gaza a genocide. And then we also have, and I think the most significant development here is a letter of 600 former Israeli security officers. We're talking about people who were elites within the army, people who were directors, people who were former prime ministers, including people like Ami Ayalon, Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, who are experts in deadly massacres themselves, signing an open letter calling on Trump to impose a ceasefire on Netanyahu and bring this war to an end. And so Netanyahu is in trouble right now. He's dealing with a lot of pressure in the international community, which we'll talk about later. And we're also looking at the rapid decline of U.S. public support for Israel, which has consequences given that the U.S. is sponsoring this war and sponsoring its military establishment. But he also has to cover for this failure in this operation and placate his far-right base. And that's why he's calling for the reoccupation of Gaza at this moment. And I should say I also fully agree with the sentiments expressed earlier that the ultimate goal here is ethnic cleansing. And I don't think there's much disagreement about that. I think there are questions about how you get there. So it should not be lost on us right now that we're approaching the 20-year anniversary of the Gaza disengagement, where Israel dismantled its settlements in Gaza, it removed its military outposts, and it withdrew something like 10,000 settlers who were living there. There are prominent leaders who lament this decision, much like Netanyahu did at the time. It was a cause of a huge rift between himself and Ariel Sharon in his final days in power. And there are those who call for the return of settlers to Gush Katif, into the Gaza Strip in general. And this issue is back in the Israeli media. Again, it's coming up more and more. And I would wager that's probably another motivating factor in why Netanyahu has brought this into his public statements. Now, to pursue this objective, Netanyahu might have to right now seek what would be the third military chief of staff that he's had in the course of the war. He's criticized the current chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, for expressing his disagreement with the idea of occupying Gaza because he prefers to continue a policy of surrounding and besieging the territory from the outside or from buffer zones or from security, whether they're buffer zones, sort of cutting through the Gaza Strip or those on the side of the Gaza Strip that are encroaching on its territory. And in response to this criticism, Zamir has not only been attacked by people like the far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who seems to be adopting sort of a Trumpian style of rhetoric when he said that Eyal Zamir was brought on because we needed a hawk, and he's making me miss his predecessor, meaning Herzi Halevi, who was dismissed for being too weak. But not only that, the prime minister himself has publicly criticized his own chief of staff, calling on him to resign if he opposes the goal. And so Netanyahu might tell his international partners, like we've alluded to earlier, that this announcement is simply a tactic to bring Hamas to the negotiating table. And with just enough enablement internally from the US, he might just proceed. And it might mean that troops in crowded areas or troops will sort of enter crowded areas like Deir el-Balah, Maghazi, Mawasi, and Sirat, and displace a civilian population and place them in this really difficult situation where they're facing slow death by starvation on the one hand, or fast death through sniper attacks, shelling, and bombardment on the other. But the rapidly changing internal Israeli picture, and I think these international calls that we've talked about in terms of global protest also might complicate this. And so I do think so much remains to be seen, but these details really are helpful in understanding why it is that this announcement comes now, and why it is that Netanyahu is willing to take these risks, given the big, the big calls in the international community, and the sort of tensions within Israel itself, why it is that he's still going out here and making this announcement at this particular time.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. Hanna, I want to add a little bit more to help viewers and listeners to sort of understand the picture on the ground. So, as the Israeli military has moved through the Gaza Strip, a very densely populated area, it has continued to move the population into different directions and increasingly concentrate them into smaller and smaller spots where the military is not on the ground. And it's done this, in a variety of different ways, including through the use of live fire, but it's also dropped all kinds of information and leaflets and maps and so on, telling them, hey, this place that you live now is an active military zone. You got to move to this place next door. And there's been a process of this going on now for 2 years, to the point where the Israeli military controls some 75 to 80% of the territory, and the population that lived there is now concentrated in that much smaller remaining space. And so for the Israeli military to operate on the ground in those places means that there's no place left for these people to go. There's no place to herd them off to. So that means a dynamic of the war that I think we have not quite yet seen. Obviously, we've seen plenty of aerial bombardment. We've seen the Israeli military operating on the ground near civilians as well. But now we're talking about a large-scale Israeli military presence among a huge concentration of Palestinian civilians on the ground. And that is, I think, different than what we've seen before. It produces an insane amount of risk and danger for the Palestinian civilians on the ground, and also, of course, for the Israeli military, which treats everybody that it sees and everything that moves as a threat in these spaces. And so it really sets the stage for what may be the bloodiest part of what has been an incredibly horrific multi-year genocide now in Gaza. I think your assessment is right, though, about the position that Netanyahu is in. It was very telling to hear some of the right-wing criticism of the Israeli chief of staff, who Netanyahu himself had picked for his own political reasons. And it seems now he's just kind of looking for some sort of answer despite being stuck, but without any real pressure from the United States, and that doesn't seem like it's coming. He may very well move ahead with this at a time where global opinion is turned more against Israel and what it's doing in Gaza than I think at any point previously. And if they were to move ahead with what would probably be the most horrific part of this war, you can only imagine how much more anger, outrage there would be in places around the world, including here in the United States, where it seems like there is a shift in the discussion. And this is something that I want to talk to all of you about. I don't know what it is about the images of starving children, or perhaps it is just the amount of time that this has all been going on for. But for some reason, in the last several weeks, it seems like something has changed in terms of how many people are willing to speak out and to say more than they've ever said before about the fact that this needs to stop, the fact that there are war crimes taking place and even genocide going on. What does this all mean, and why is it happening now? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And you know, it's clearly not enough yet. How much more is it going to take to create the kind of pressure that we need to see to actually bring an end to this? Rami, do you want to kick us off here?
So a couple of points I think that are really important, and this was mentioned before, I think by Yara, I'm not sure, maybe you use it, but why is it that these pictures of starving children or dying, a starving child is more powerful image even than a dead child, which is crazy, but that's how it is. And I think that there's something at play here, which is that historically, if you go back over the years, the pictures of the starving captives, the Jewish captives in the concentration camps when they were freed, starving captives at Sarajevo, remember those pictures years ago? The starving people in South Sudan years ago. There's something about starving, skinny bones and flesh people that has an impact. It speaks of not only death, but it speaks of deliberately caused death. And this has combined with a steady flow of reports by credible institutions, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, UN agencies, and the last actor in this dynamic is more and more Jewish or Israeli genocide and Holocaust experts coming out and saying, this is genocide, we can't accept it. And there's been a slew of articles by very decent, learned Jewish men and women around the world saying, this is destroying Judaism. And so all of these things have come together, pushing finally the Western media. And live in the Boston area, and I watch every night around. After I finish watching baseball games, I turn on the news for about half an hour, CNN and ABC and Fox. I just check each of them. In the last week, we've had an unprecedented flow of mainstream television presentations by people who are very critical of Israel, with some pro-Israeli guests, but the hosts are basically telling the pro-Israeli guests, please stop giving us these talking points that you get from your handlers. Talk about the facts, and what do you do about this fact? And so the Israeli narrative is being challenged on mainstream American television, as it is being challenged in the Congress by some people in a way that's never happened before. So we're clearly at a turning point because of all of these things happening simultaneously, to the point where some people in Europe are saying or Canada, we're going to recognize Palestinian state. But that's a separate issue. But this is a clearly historical turning point that we have to keep our eye on and keep pushing in the right direction.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rami, that there is something about these particular images for some reason that have an added effect. But I think it's also cumulative. I think it's everything that we've been seeing over time, but also the fact that there was a ceasefire deal. The Israelis were the ones who decided to violate it, right? There was a war on Iran as well. The United States got involved They gave Netanyahu everything on his wish list. They bombed Iran with, the big bombs that the Israelis have been dreaming to get the Americans to use. Hezbollah has been beaten back in Lebanon. The Iranians are licking their wounds. The United States stood by as Israel said, we want to kick the UN out of Gaza and do this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation thing. And after all of that, what we see is the images that we're getting today, the starvation, no vision from where to go here, no progress on the issue, and no more excuses left for Israel, right? No more excuses left. So it's very hard now, I think, in this moment, to still kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. And many of the long-standing defenders of Israel, including some voices on the right, are finding it harder to give them the benefit of the doubt today. But it's not enough just yet. We saw a vote the other day in the U.S. Senate. For the first time, a majority of Democrats in the Senate voted to withhold some weapon sales to Israel. Yeah, that's a big deal, but still the majority of senators supported continued weapon sales to Israel. So there's still a long way to go, but there is a change in the conversation, not just among Democrats, but also in some spaces in the right. That continues to grow. And you have to wonder what is going to come of that. I think it's been clear for many years now that the conversation among Democrats was probably going to move in this direction. There's just a fundamental contradiction between what Israel is doing on the ground to Palestinians and the values that Democrats proclaim to uphold, right? Yeah. But on the right, it's a different dynamic. Yet now we're starting to see growing criticism in those spaces. What do we make of this?
Yeah, I just had one last sentence and then I'll shut up. The primary for the Democratic mayor race in New York was a real shocker. When Zohran Mamdani won, this really scared the daylights out of not just Democrats or New Yorkers, but the whole political class is really scared. And this is a message that all these young people, different religions and political groups or whatever, are shifting. So this has to be factored in that when the political class starts to worry about its incumbency, it thinks about changing its position.
If I could also add one more thing, too, that I would throw out there, in addition to the reasons about why this has mobilized U.S. public opinion, these images of starvation, I think everything that's been presented so far are, I think, great explanations. But one more thing that I would throw out there is that I'm noticing for the first time in a very wide segment of the population, especially within the right wing, this issue is now being entangled with really big concerns in the United States about a cost of living crisis, right? That I think it's tapping into really deep fears that any parent would have that, our government is bankrolling the forced starvation of this population and their massacre. And it raises serious, concerns about that itself and what it means to support something like this. But also, I think on some level, this fear that this could happen here someday or some version of this, when people can't afford groceries, when they can't afford rent, when younger generations can't afford to buy homes. It's hard to say this, but I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene might have been one of the loudest voices sort of linking what's happening right now to sort of economic concerns. Now, for many of us, there's a gap in the analysis, about, what sort of conclusions that should draw about your answers to problems in the United States. But these things are being linked. And I think that, food insecurity, rates are on the rise, and they were already, very high before recent changes. And Trump had promised his base that groceries would be cheaper, that eggs would be cheaper. And so I do think that some of these things are entangled under the surface for a lot of people, and it has been mobilizing them.
If I could very also briefly just jump in, and I totally agree with what Rami and Hanna have said. I think there's a couple of other trends. I mean, the thing is, this is this almost stereotypical huge topic that is not easy to steer away from the direction that it's already been going. So it's really shocking, but also completely predictable that it's taken almost 2 years of basically seeing this every day, being challenged, seeing polling change, to even see these minor steps. And I also want to make sure that we're not, even though the conversation is changing, the discourse is changing, we're seeing some state actors take action against the state of Israel or IDF soldiers. Small, tiny, almost inconsequential steps look to us like huge steps because we're used to nobody doing anything at all. For example, the statehood conversation that's happening now, I don't know a single Palestinian for whom a statehood declaration in 2 months is their primary concern. So I think there's also getting this tangle of wanting to look like you're doing something without actually challenging the status quo. When I talk to regular folks, quote unquote, regular folks, the Hamas argument has completely fallen apart here, that Israel is targeting Hamas. I mean, it doesn't take 30 seconds online to note what that is. The hostages argument has also completely fallen apart. I don't know anyone who could in good faith argue that the hostages are in the top 10 of the priorities of the Israeli government. The world is increasingly seeing what is the good guys who they thought were the good guys paying and politically defending a regime that is starving people. I think that has been part of it. I think also, too, for better or for worse, although Palestinians and some other allies have been calling this genocide since mid-October, permission structures are also changing. So just a few weeks ago, you saw B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights coming out and saying this is genocide. Yes, they're incredibly late, but again, whether we like it or not, entities within Israel have the power to sway public opinion in ways that people like us can't. We have the former, I believe, Attorney General of Israel tweeting that he now believes it's genocide. So I think the long leash that Israel has been given by the United States and its other allies have actually come full circle to this point now where Israel's completely outlandish claims of basically anyone and every entity who criticizes or critiques them in any way that, are, talking blood libels, they're anti-Semitic, they're closet Hamas. I mean, it would almost be a comical level of accusation and projection if the consequences have not been so dire. So I think that force as well, when you tell people the children that you're seeing starving, if you blame Israel for that, that is a blood libel. I think people are starting to say, well, that just makes no sense. So it's unfortunate that all of these dynamics have been pointed out since the beginning. I mean, Holocaust scholar Roz Siegel was on Democracy Now! October 13th, 2023, saying this is a textbook case of genocidal incitement. The chorus has only, of not just Palestinians, but atrocity scholars, human rights organizations, human rights scholars, I could go on and on and on at this point, are saying this is genocide. Now, some of them are arguing this wasn't a genocide, but it is now. And we can get into or we don't even have to, but we can talk about it, have discussions about what it means to say that the first few months were justified, but suddenly it's not okay. If what we're saying is what's unfolding today is only able to happen because of what was allowed for the 18 months before that. And then I think the political changes as well. I think a lot of the Democrats that we have been criticizing could not or would not be willing to see this as a genocide unfolding under Biden. Now they're willing to say, well, this is the genocide of President Trump. Good faith, again, shows that nothing that has happened today did not start. And we also saw tens of thousands of deaths under the Biden administration. But for, again, better or for worse, this is how politics works in this country. So I think when you have some of the least liked, least credible, least seem to have very strange motivations for what they're doing are the only ones at this point defending Israel's behavior, that allows for the Overton window of what is acceptable to shift. We're seeing it happen, albeit extremely slowly. And importantly, no one is doing anything on the ground right now to stop people from dying. So discourse shift is one thing. We need action.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that note on something that you had raised, Yara, for our final point of discussion, and that's, some of these countries like France and the UK and Canada and some others who, decided to join most of the rest of the world and announced their intention to recognize a state of Palestine. I think there's something like 150 out of nearly 200 countries that already recognize a state of Palestine. And the latecomers are almost entirely, European states. Now, and American allies, of course, close American allies. Now that is starting to change. But, the thing about it, as you note, that's not helping anyone in Gaza right now. It's not making a difference. And a lot of these countries are really directly complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And as much as conversation is changing here in the United States, I think publics in Europe have really been at this place for a very, very long time. They've been infuriated about this thing for a long time. They've wanted to see their governments change their policies for a very long time. And all the governments can seem to muster is, these statements about recognition of a Palestinian state that doesn't even touch on the situation in Gaza right now. So what do we make of all of this? Because there has been a lot of pomp and circumstance around this issue. There was a big conference in New York that was sort of led by the Saudis and the French around this rallying support for recognition of a Palestinian state. And there was also a statement from the Arab League that kind of came along with that. That condemned Hamas at the same time. What do we make of all of these pronouncements, these diplomatic positions at a time where there is a very real and urgent crisis on the ground that most of the world is outraged about, but the people in charge don't seem to be doing anything about?
I think there's two factors. One is the wellspring of massive global public sentiment has become so overwhelming that it can't be ignored. The second point is that some of the officials in these Western countries are perhaps realizing quietly that they may be held liable legally for being complicit in the genocide, because legal action is becoming much more common and sophisticated, and hasn't yet sent anybody to court for being complicit. But the pressures are growing on officials to do what is happening spontaneously in civil society, where port workers refuse to load a ship of arms going to Israel, or a crowd at a soccer game in Europe refuses to allow their coach to hire an Israeli player. You're getting this spontaneous, global, intense, and rising support for Palestinian rights. This is essentially for equal Palestinian and Israeli rights side by side in some form that they might negotiate. So I think these are important signs of change, but change takes a long time. Policy changes, we know from Vietnam and from South Africa and other cases, you start with these small events, public opinion grows, and finally it reaches the political class. So these declarations of statehood are important, but they also come tinged with a little reminder that these are still colonial powers. They won't come right out and say the Palestinians and the Israelis have absolutely equal rights. They put demands on the Palestinians that we will recognize your state if you do this and this and this. We're like truant delinquents. And so there's still not full equality in the eyes of Western colonial powers, major powers, full equality between Israel and Palestine, but they're reacting to political stresses more than anything else, which is an important development that we need to keep pursuing.
I think too, if I could just jump in quickly, it's become very frustrating because increasingly, even in the rhetoric about recognizing Palestinian statehood, it's almost never seen as something something for Palestinians. It is seen as punishment to the state of Israel. If Israel does not do XYZ or does not allow us to do XYZ, then we will recognize a Palestinian state, because they know that there is nothing that the Israeli state, the Israeli government at the moment would want less. I've never heard so often in my life by some of these diplomats making these statements that Palestinians have an inalienable right to statehood. But it is apparently only a right that they see fit to bring at this stage, when really the existential reality of Palestinians has never been so real. I mean, I can only imagine that this is also being brought on by the unprecedented push for annexation in the West Bank, which all of these states have spent so much time talking about as unacceptable, this, that, and the other. It's happening. It's literally happening. Whether it's happening politically in the Knesset, which it is, or happening physically on the ground, which it is. So we're seeing this at the same time, and it's almost like they're waiting for the Palestinian state to be crumbs before they say, now we're going to recognize the state. What is the state? Who lives in the state? What are the rights of the people in that state? Are Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon citizens of that state? What is the relation of Jerusalem to that state? Unless and until these, not questions, these are the fundamental issues of Palestinian statehood to begin with. So until they start actually taking action and making moves and answering those questions, and as Rami said, the idea that this is something that these world powers will bequeath generously to Palestinians is in and of itself so problematic. So I find it very hard to see this as a real positive step.
Yeah, it is hard to see it as a positive step. That's for sure. I mean, the way that I understand it, for the most part, is that these governments are looking for ways to respond to the discontent among their own publics with policy tools that they can reach for. And this is what there is. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't help the situation on the ground, but they see it as something that they can do to address some of this. But I think very, very few people are going to be convinced by these efforts, not least of which the folks in Gaza, or even for that matter, the people in the Israeli government. Far, far more concrete steps and pressure will have to be necessary. But we'll leave it for there for our discussion today. Thank you all, as always, for joining us for another Hiwar episode, and we'll leave more questions for discussion for another day.